Artemis 3 and the missions planned after it need to be scrapped and the entire effort restarted, carefully but without dragging our feet. Too much time has already slipped away. At this point, it is unclear whether a return to the moon will happen before China carries out its own first landing. It still could, or it might not.
Artemis breaks. January 14, 2025 began like any other oversight hearing in the Rayburn House office building. Lawmakers filed into their seats expecting the familiar rhythm of budget lines, schedule slips, and cautious reassurances. The Artemis program, after all, was already years deep. Contracts signed, hardware under construction, and public promises made. Nothing about the agenda suggested disruption. Victor, Christina, Jeremy, we're going to the moon. Then Mike Griffin entered the room, carrying a thin folder and the weight of a man who had already made up his mind. Griffin was 75, a former NASA administrator with decades in systems engineering, national security space, and launch vehicle design. He did not posture or dramatize. He sat, adjusted the microphone, opened the folder, and spoke with the flat tone of someone describing a failed stress test rather than a national program. Artemis 3 and the missions after it, he said, should be canceled. For a self-declared adversary to occupy a human frontier that we can no longer reach should be understood as an existential concern. The architecture itself was flawed. Starting over was not optional, it was necessary. Griffin did not attack personalities or contractors, he went straight to physics. Artemis, as designed, requires the lunar lander to stage from a near rectilineal halo orbit, a distant looping path tens of thousands of miles from the lunar surface. That orbit exists to accommodate the gateway station, but it comes at a cost. From that position, a lander must burn roughly 1,000 meters per second of additional delta V just to reach the moon. In propulsion terms, that penalty is brutal. Every meter per second demands propellant, structure, insulation, engines, and margin. And it has the capability to operate on its own for 21 days in deep space. Griffin explained how the math cascades. A single-stage lander grows by roughly 25% just to absorb the added velocity. A two-stage design fares better but still suffers. Added mass drives to larger tanks. Larger tanks increase surface area. Surface area worsens boil-off. The lander becomes heavier, hotter, more complex, and less forgiving. This is not clever engineering, Griffin said. It is the opposite. Good design shifts burdens away from the most fragile element. Artemis does the reverse. He turned the page. Artemis relies on extensive in-space refueling using liquid oxygen and liquid methane, cryogenic propellants that behave poorly in sunlight and vacuum. These fluids absorb heat, build pressure, and must be vented to avoid tank rupture. So they're burning different elements, constantly releasing energy. Every venting event bleeds usable propellant. No one could say how many tanker launches would be required to fully fuel the lander. The number was not fixed. It depended on boil-off rates, thermal shielding performance, docking timelines, and orbital lighting conditions, all variables still being modeled rather than measured. Griffin emphasized that none of this had been demonstrated in space at the required scale. Not once, not with crews waiting. Artemis combined multiple firsts into a single mission profile. Long-duration cryogenic storage, repeated orbital docking, mass transfer between vehicles, and human landing operations staged far from the moon. NASA gives the okay for the crew to launch, they'll do so in the spacecraft integrity. Compared to Apollo, which launched, landed, and returned using a tightly integrated sequence, Artemis multiplied interfaces and failure modes. Complexity, Griffin said, does not merely add cost, it adds risk, and risk eventually reaches the crew. He stopped speaking for a moment, then said the sentence that landed hardest. The current plan was unlikely to work, unlikely to the point where he was willing to say it could not work. Griffin slid the document across the table. 53 pages of diagrams, mass tables, and trajectory plots. His alternative was called the dual-launch lunar landing architecture. It borrowed heavily from proven concepts while updating them with modern lift capacity. 2 Space Launch System Block II rockets would be used. The first would launch Orion attached to a Centaur upper stage. That Centaur would not separate after Earth orbit insertion. It would ride with Orion to the Moon and perform the lunar orbit insertion burn, placing the crew directly into low lunar orbit. The second Block 2 would launch the lander. Because Orion's insertion had already been handled, the lander would arrive with its fuel untouched. The two vehicles would rendezvous in low lunar orbit, not a distant halo. The crew would transfer, the lander would descend, complete surface operations, return to orbit, dock again, and wait for the Earth departure window. No gateway, no refueling, no propellant depots, no technologies that had not already flown in some form. That camaraderie is going to be important on the mission. It's short, only 9.5 days, but it will be in very close quarters. Griffin's numbers showed that a Block 2 with a Centaur stage could deliver 32 tons directly into low lunar orbit. That mass supported a 4-person lander with a margin. The mission profile was shorter, simpler, and cleaner. Most notably, it removed SpaceX entirely from the landing sequence. By the time Griffin reached the building lobby, the story was already live. Bloomberg published first, quoting his conclusion that Artemis was unlikely to work. Reuters followed minutes later. Cable networks picked it up before the afternoon cycle. Clips of the testimony spread across engineering forums and private group chats. At Starbase in Texas, SpaceX engineers paused mid-shift, phones out, watching the hearing footage play on muted screens. The words "cannot work" appeared again and again in captions. Some laughed, others frowned. One propulsion engineer with 6 years at the company shook his head and went back to a test stand. Starship Flight 12 was 3 weeks away. Hardware did not stop because Washington argued. SpaceX has carried out a successful test flight of the world's largest and most powerful rocket. Elon Musk saw the coverage that evening. 8 hours later, he responded publicly. Griffin's plan, he wrote, was a worse version of Apollo. Starship, by contrast, was designed for scale. It could support a permanently occupied lunar base, even a city. The comment lit up timelines and hardened positions. Supporters of Artemis cheered the pushback. Critics accused Musk of deflection. Yet Griffin's critique had exposed uncomfortable facts. Behind every technical dispute sat an unspoken pressure. China was building quietly, methodically, without congressional hearings or public infighting. Launch vehicles were stacking, timelines were compressing. China has launched a spacecraft to allow them to bring 3 astronauts stuck in the country's space station back to Earth. The question left hanging after Griffin's testimony was not which architecture was cleaner or simpler, it was which one would reach the Moon first, and whether the United States could afford another restart while its rival kept moving forward.
The 2026 Gauntlet. Inside the megabay at Starbase, floodlights washed the upper section of Booster 19 in hard white glare as technicians guided the forward dome, known internally as FX3, into position. The metal still carried the chill of recent cryogenic proof tests, its surface dull and unpolished. At the top sat the revised hot staging ring, reinforced to survive 6 Raptor engines igniting while the booster remained mechanically joined to the ship above. This was no longer experimental hardware, it was flight-critical structure. A dozen technicians moved in tight coordination around the booster, inspecting weld seams, verifying electrical continuity, and closing out inspection tags. The pace was deliberate but urgent. Flight 12 was tracking for late January or early February, and delays now would echo through the entire year. Every integration step here fed directly into a deadline that could not slip without consequence. SpaceX's newest generation of rocket blasted off from Texas on a test flight with a lot riding on it. By the end of 2026, SpaceX must clear a threshold that goes far beyond test flights and recovery attempts. Starship must reach the Moon. The requirement is specific and unforgiving, an uncrewed human landing system mission that places a lunar variant of Starship onto the surface and brings it back to orbit intact. This flight is written into the NASA contract. Without it, the argument for placing astronauts aboard Starship for a lunar landing collapses under scrutiny. That mission depends first on the launch of the dedicated Starship Human Landing System prototype, which must fly no later than mid-2026. The window matters. It creates room for inspections, fault analysis, corrective design work, and reflight. With a vehicle as complex as Starship, anomalies are expected. Margin is not a luxury, it is survival. Before that mission can even be scheduled, SpaceX must complete a tightly linked chain of demonstrations across 2026, each one unlocking the next. The first gate is Starship version 3. Flight 12 carries that burden. Version 3 introduces major changes across the vehicle, including reinforced hot staging hardware, redesigned grid fins, improved Raptor engine performance envelopes, upgraded heat shield attachment methods, enhanced catch interfaces, and the first flight-ready configuration of the on-orbit refilling system. The outcome of Flight 12 will shape the rest of the year. A clean flight accelerates operational objectives and pushes lunar objectives forward. A flawed one compresses timelines that are already narrow and forces difficult trade-offs between speed and risk. Once version 3 is validated, Starship must demonstrate routine orbital insertion. Without reliable access to orbit, nothing else matters. Payload deployment follows. Starship is expected to begin launching the third generation of Starlink satellites, with each flight capable of deploying dozens at once. Starship provides unmatched capability to explore the moon thanks to its large size and ability to refill propellant in space. Every successful payload mission strengthens confidence in Starship as a logistics platform rather than an experimental vehicle. Recovery and landing come next. Bringing Starship back through Earth's atmosphere and landing it intact validates guidance, navigation, propulsion control, and structural margins. These same systems underpin lunar landing performance, where precision and stability matter even more due to limited abort options and delayed communications. The most technically demanding requirement sits above them all: orbital refilling. Starship cannot reach the moon with a usable payload unless it is refueled in orbit. This demands a coordinated sequence of launches, autonomous rendezvous, docking, cryogenic fluid transfer, and long-duration propellant management across multiple vehicles. Early demonstrations are expected around mid-year, beginning with 2 Starships proving they can meet, connect, and separate in orbit. Later tests must show repeatability, because a single lunar mission may require many refilling flights. Progress is already visible. SpaceX has completed a depot power module demonstration, validating prototype electrical generation and distribution hardware intended for propellant depot variants. A hardware-in-the-loop testbed for propellant transfer has also gone active, using flight representative components to simulate real mission conditions and failure modes. Launch infrastructure is expanding in parallel. At Starbase, Pad 2 is nearing readiness for version 3 operations, while Pad 1 is undergoing upgrades aimed at returning it to service in the second half of 2026. SpaceX, responsible for the design and the building and the execution of both. In Florida, modifications continue at Launch Complex 39A, with work also advancing at Space Launch Complex 37, which is expected to come online the following year. Manufacturing capacity is scaling just as fast. The Star Factory is scheduled to reach full operational output in 2026, becoming the first facility designed for serial production of orbital-class rockets. The new Gigabay is under construction and expected to be operational by the second quarter alongside the existing Megabays. This will allow multiple Starship vehicles to be assembled at the same time. On December 18th, Test Tank 17 passed its 12th pressure test without leaks or structural failure. That same afternoon, FX-3 was mated to Booster 19. Only the main methane tank remained. If completed before the 24th, it would mark the fastest booster build in company history. Every weld, every test, every launch point toward one destination: the moon. And just as SpaceX accelerated toward it, forces far beyond the launch site were preparing to intervene.